Hi everyone, Professor Sackett-Taylor here again with the second half of the video lecture for Principles of Microeconomics on the topic of elasticity. In the first video in this lecture series, we talked about what elasticity measures, how we can actually calculate it numerically, and the different determinants of the price elasticity of demand. We left off here with the relationship between price elasticity of demand and total revenue, one of the most important business applications of this concept. Here's the idea. Total revenue is the amount of money that a firm receives from the sale of the goods and services it produces. It's calculated as the sales price of the good times the quantity of that good sold. Elasticity is related to total revenue, and firms will want to know how changing their price will affect total revenue based on the demand for their products. So basically, we can show graphically the trade-offs that a firm faces when they choose to change the price of the good that it's selling. If they increase the price of the good that they're selling, the good news is that they're receiving a higher price per unit, meaning a larger profit margin on each unit. But the bad news is that the law of demand tells us that when the price of something goes up, people will buy less of it. So although you're getting a greater profit margin on each unit, you'll sell fewer units overall. The opposite is also true. If you were to lower your price, the good news is that the law of demand tells us when things get cheap, people buy more of it. So by lowering your price, people will buy more of your product. But the bad news is that by lowering your price, you're receiving a lower price per unit, meaning a smaller profit margin per unit. So you can see that there's kind of pros and cons, good news and bad news to this price change stuff. And what a firm really needs to know is what is the magnitude of the demand response that's going to result from me changing the price of the item that I sell. Is this response going to be really large? Meaning, do I have elastic demand for my product? Or is the response going to be relatively small? Meaning I have inelastic demand for my product. Let's look at a graph. Here's a graph of the market for skinny lattes. We've got quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. And we can see that in the elastic region, at the high prices associated with this demand curve. Since demand is elastic, it means that the response to a reduction in price is going to be large. In fact, by having elastic demand, it means that the response is actually going to be larger than the initial price change. And so we can see here that if we were to, for example, lower our price from $4 per unit to $3 per unit, that means that we would lose $1 on every unit sold. However, because we've lowered our price, it means we're going to sell more of our product. And so for each product that we sell, now that first product and that second product, we're now going to gain money by selling that second product. So let me back up here. I was originally selling my product at $4 per unit. And at this price, given the demand curve, I can see that I only sell one unit. So that would be a total of $4 in revenue, right? One unit times $4 per unit. If I reduce my price from $4 down to $3, this demand curve indicates that I will sell 2 units. So even though I've lost the previous dollar from selling from selling the unit at $4 instead of $3, what I've gained is I'm selling a whole second unit at $3. So my total revenue now is $3 times 2 units, or $6 in revenue. So you can see that by reducing the price on an elastic good, you actually gain total revenue because the quantity increase is going to exceed the price decrease. But now let's look at if we were living somewhere in the middle of our demand curve at unitary elasticity, meaning that elasticity is exactly 1 and that the percent change in our demand is exactly equivalent to the percent change in price. Meaning if we reduce our price by 10%, we gain 10% more customers. We reduce our price by 30%, we gain 30% more customers. So here we can see that it'll be a little bit of a wash in that if we were to lower our price from $3 down to $2, at $3, we had 2 customers for a total revenue of $6. We sold 2 units. But now at $2, I gain a customer, but I lose $1 on each of those first 2 units that I sold. So now I'm selling for $2 and I sell 3 units. Well, my revenue is still $6. So we can see that if we have unitary elasticity, meaning that the percent change in price and the percent change in demand are exactly equivalent, then we'll see no change in our total revenue as the result of a price change. However, if I'm living in the inelastic region of my demand at low prices, we can see that if I was selling things at $2 per unit, I sell 3 units. But if I drop my price down to $1 per unit, I'm going to sell 4 units. Well, when I was selling at $2, 3 units, that's a total revenue of $6. When I drop my price to $1 and I only sell 4 units, my total revenue actually goes down to $4. And that's because demand is inelastic. So I dropped the price, but the quantity demanded increased by a smaller amount, meaning that I wasn't able to recoup the losses associated with lowering that price. So here, if you reduce the price on an inelastic good, you can actually expect your total revenues to go down. That's why it's important for a firm to understand the elasticity for its own product. If you have an elastic product, people are very sensitive to price changes. And by reducing your price by a small amount, you'll gain a lot of more customers. But if you have an inelastic product, people are not very sensitive to price changes. And so if you lower your price by some amount, people are going to increase demand, but not by very much. And this actually could cut into your total revenues. So suppose a firm is selling a product at a price that's in the inelastic portion of their demand line. This firm could increase revenue by doing what? Well, it's inelastic, meaning people are not going to be very sensitive to price, right? And so if what we actually want to do here is that if we increase the price, people will basically continue to buy basically the same amount because they're inelastic. Remember, they're not very sensitive. So by raising the price, I'll get more money for every unit, even though I'm selling slightly fewer units. Overall, the impact of this, of increasing the price on an inelastic good, is actually to gain revenue. So that was all about price elasticity of demand. Once we understand the concept of elasticity in general, now I can introduce different ways we use elasticity to look at the relationship between variables. So like I said, price elasticity of demand measures the demand response to a change in price. So if I'm talking about income elasticity of demand, I'm talking about the demand response to an increase or decrease in income. So we know that income is a demand curve shifter, but the question is by how much? The income elasticity of demand will measure how a change in income affects overall spending. It can be positive or negative. For normal goods, we know that the income relationship is positive, and so elasticity will be positive, right? As our income goes up, we buy more normal goods. For necessities, we have demand that tends to fall between 0 and 1. So this is inelastic demand, meaning that when something is necessary and our income goes up or down, we pretty much keep buying the same amount of stuff because it's a necessity. We can't buy too much more or too much less of it. But for luxuries, we do see an income elasticity that is positive, meaning that we are sensitive to the price of luxuries, and therefore also sensitive to how our income can cover our spending habits on luxuries. So when our income goes up, we see a large increase in the purchase of luxury items. And when our income goes down, we see a large decrease in the purchase of luxury items. So in other words, we're very sensitive to income changes for luxuries. Inferior goods have negative elasticities. Remember, inferior goods are defined by having an opposite or opposal relationship between quantity demanded and income. That is, when our income goes up, we actually buy fewer inferior goods, meaning the elasticity will be negative. The formula takes a similar format. The price elasticity of demand put price changes on the bottom and demand changes on the top. Remember, I said that you always put the response on the top. So here it's demand that's responding to income. So we put the percent change of income in the bottom of this fraction, and we put the percent change in quantity demanded in the top of this fraction. So some of these goods are inferior, some of them are necessities, and some of them are luxuries. While we can generalize for most of the population, this also is a personal preference kind of thing in terms of what you view as a necessity. One thing that's a necessity for one person might not be a necessity for others, but you should do your own evaluation now. Which of these goods for you feel inferior? Meaning if you had more money, you'd actually buy less of them. Which of these goods feel like a necessity for you? That basically you wouldn't respond very much to price changes because you're going to buy the same amount no matter what. Which of these goods are luxury goods for you? Things that you're going to be very sensitive to price and income changes around. Let's suppose that Doug receives a pay increase at work. His income is increased by 20%. As a result, Doug decides to buy 12% less ground beef. So for Doug, ground beef is what kind of good? Since his income went up and he bought less of it, this makes ground beef an inferior good for Doug. Another kind of elasticity we can study has to do with the price of related goods. Remember, goods have two kinds of relationships. They can either be complements or substitutes. The cross price elasticity of demand is looking at changes in the price of complements and substitutes and how they affect demand for a specific good. So we're going to measure it again as the response of demand for good A to a price change of good B. Again, this elasticity, cross price elasticity, can be negative or positive. Substitutes will have a positive cross price elasticity. This is because of the positive relationship between price and demand. Let me give you an example. With Coke and Pepsi, they're substitutes. If the price of Pepsi goes up, we know that we're going to substitute away from Pepsi and towards Coke, meaning that we will buy more Coca-Cola products rather than Pepsi products. And so that would give us a positive elasticity in the sense that in response to a change in the price of Pepsi, we have a positive impact on our demand for Coke. Complementary goods are the opposite. These are things we like to consume together, like peanut butter and jelly. If peanut butter gets expensive, not only do we buy less peanut butter, but we also buy less jelly. So the demand response is negative to a positive price change. This positive negative situation in a fraction makes it so that the elasticity overall is negative. We do the same format. We put the response in the numerator or the top of the fraction, and the thing that's changing in the denominator, the bottom of the fraction. So here, we've got the percent change in the quantity demanded of one good on the top divided by the percent change in the price of a good that's related to it. Economists have studied that when the price of chicken increases, people tend to purchase less rice. With these two goods, which of the following would be true? Well, if the price of chicken increases, we're going to buy less chicken. This story tells us we also buy less rice. This must mean that for us, chicken and rice are complements, and that would mean that they would have a negative cross price elasticity. Finally, this has all had to do with demand side of the market, but we can use elasticities to look at supply side responses as well, because producers also respond to changes in price. The price elasticity of supply is going to measure the responsiveness of the quantity supplied to a change in price. The price elasticity of supply is related to the flexibility of the producers. The more production is flexible means that the firms are going to be more able to respond to changes in price. A firm has more productive flexibility if it has spare capacity, if it maintains a positive inventory, and if it's able to relocate easily. Time horizons also impact price elasticity of supply. In the immediate run, like this week, suppliers are pretty much stuck with whatever they have in hand, and it's very hard to make immediate adjustments. So in the short run, supply tends to be relatively inelastic. But in the long run, over time, firms are able to adjust to market conditions, and supply becomes more elastic with longer time horizons. So we can use this in graphical form, just like before, with the same rule applying. The more vertical the curve, the less elastic it is. The rule you can remember is more elastic, flatter curve. And so here, S1 is the least elastic supply, with S3 being the most elastic supply. We can calculate the price elasticity of supply and note that the ratio will always be positive because of the law of supply, which tells us that price changes and supply responses always move in the same direction. That is, when you can sell your product at higher prices, a producer would be incentivized to sell more of it, and at lower prices, incentivized to sell less of it. The price elasticity of supply will put the responding variable on top, the percent change in the quantity supplied, and it will divide by the changing variable, which in this case was price. We have previously drawn shifts in the supply and demand model and then used the graphing to actually establish predictions for future changes in equilibrium prices and quantities. So how does the magnitude of that price and quantity change get affected if we change the demand elasticity or the supply elasticity? Well, remember, this is going to have to do with how steep or how flat those curves are. So here's an example. If we start with demand 1, which is light blue, and short run supply, our equilibrium point is E1, with an equilibrium price of $60 and an equilibrium quantity of Q1. Now, let's let demand shift to the right. This is an increase in demand for oil from China. We shift that demand curve to the right. In the short run, we look for the new point of intersection on our short run supply curve. This is at E2. The equilibrium price has gone up to $90 and the equilibrium quantity has increased to Q2. But remember, over time, supply is more elastic, meaning that in the long run, the supply curve will be flatter, given by this long run supply curve in dark red. The long run supply curve intersects the new demand curve at this point E3, where we can see prices have adjusted downwards a bit to $80 in equilibrium, and quantities have continued to increase to Q3. This is a really cool application of using elasticities to determine the best way forward in terms of establishing policies that we want to use to change human behavior. I'm not going to go through it in this lecture because this is something I want to talk about in class together and get your opinions on. So that's where I'm going to wrap up here with this video lecture on elasticity. It's a good thing to go back and revisit the different kinds of elasticity that we covered in the second half of this lecture. We started by talking about price elasticity of demand. We then also talked about income elasticity of demand, and cross price elasticity of demand. Finally, we rounded out this lecture with price elasticity of supply. So there are 4 different kinds of elasticities that you need to wrap your head around in this half of the lecture. I'll see you in class and we'll talk about this policy application then. See you next time.